art teachers on.
Is there anybody in the room that disagrees with that statement?
Was a student of 16.
Doesn't seem like it. Okay. So now the thing is, we all believe that it's real, but the problem is that we kind of think about it the same way we think about homework. It's one of those things that we know is really important. We know that it's got a significant impact on our lives, but yet we're not really, ready to take any action on it right now. It's the kind of thing we'd rather put off until some other time. We know that it's important, but not exactly motivated to do anything about it right now. And part of the problem, I think, is this. Now, it's interesting that I put this up here, given the focus of the class, but I think that you really can't even look at a polar bear these days without thinking about climate change. It's become such a symbol of our trying to take action on climate change that it's become ubiquitous with climate change. The problem is, though, that feels very separate from our lives. I can't talk, I don't know about you guys, but I don't really see polar bears very often. I don't really feel connected to them on a day-to-day basis, and I really don't feel a direct connection to these polar bears, other than I think they're beautiful and I'd like to do something to help them. But, in terms of, really having a direct impact on my day-to-day life, it's hard to make the connection. So what do we understand? Well, when we're in grade school, we all learn about things like this. We learn about hydrological cycles. You know that when it rains, that rain goes into the soil, eventually it makes its way back into the ocean, the water evaporates, it makes its way back into clouds, and you've got this cycle. We understand these basic concepts, these ecosystem cycles, right? And we also understand things like this, our food webs. Now, this is a slightly more complex one, but as you can see here, this is basically the connection between human beings and where our food comes from, and where we fit into these ideas of a food chain or food web. And just to prove the point, here's the very same thing simplified. So even really young kids understand this idea that there's a connection between the sun, the earth, the food that we eat, and ourselves. So we do understand systems. We understand that we're part of these ecological systems. The problem is that there's kind of a disconnect when we start looking at it on this scale. We don't necessarily see the direct connection between ourselves and these things that have implications other places in the world. We don't necessarily see the connection between our day-to-day action here in British Columbia and things that are happening elsewhere in the world, or things that are going to be happening right here at home in the not-too-distant future. In fact, some things that are happening right now right in our own province. So what you're looking at there is Delta, British Columbia. That's some of our best farmland, and it's being paved over to make way for the South Fraser Perimeter Road, which is part of the Gateway project, which we're talking about tonight. And I'm going to make an argument that basically what we need to do is to start seeing the same kinds of connections between this and what's going on other places in the world as we see between that kid with the cow and the sun. We need to start broadening out our understanding of interconnectedness. So, and there's another part of that, which is stuff like this. This is a pipeline that's going to be moving crude oil, or actually bitumen, from the tar sands to tankers off the coast of British Columbia. And there's a lot of this pipeline going on right now. I'm going to touch on it really briefly, but really the point is that there's connections between this, and this. But there's not just connections to that, there's also connections to things like this. Now this is flooding happening in China. And China is a big part of this discussion because Gateway is really about our relationship with the Asia-Pacific region. The Gateway plan is a plan to expand Canada's trade relationship with China and India by building more and more port infrastructure right here in British Columbia. So there's a connection to that. There's also a connection to this. This used to be a river. This is in Darfur, and this is now desertification, which we're seeing happening all over the world. So I think what's important to remember when we talk about climate change or about global warming is that it's really about the impacts on ecosystems that we're really concerned about. It's not necessarily just the temperature of the planet, but it's what happens because of the temperature of the planet changing. It's the destabilization of ecological systems that we count on to keep us going on a day-to-day basis. So, for example, there's a large population that no longer can survive in this area because that river no longer exists. And what is this really all about in Canada? Well, my argument is it's this stuff. Does anybody know what that is? It's bitumen. It's bitumen. Has anybody ever seen this stuff personally? It's pretty gunky, gooey stuff. And we've gotten to the point where the last remaining oil on our planet that you can actually take out from the ground looks a lot like this. It's not the bubbling stuff that it used to exist in the 1960s, 70s. This is what we've got in Canada. It's this stuff that's buried deep beneath the boreal forest that we're digging up to turn into oil. And it comes from places that look like this. This is an open pit mine in the Athabasca tar sands. Right? It was once described as Mordor by Maud Barlow. And just to put it in perspective, we've only excavated 3% of the existing bitumen in British Columbia, or in Alberta, I should say, in Canada. And if we continue to expand the tar sands, it's been estimated that there's actually enough bitumen underground in the tar sands to, if that is all burned, to actually raise the temperature of the planet by 2 degrees, all by itself, which is what they say is the tipping point in terms of how much more increase in temperature that the planet can actually take. So obviously the problem is not just the destruction that comes from open pit mines, but it's the stuff that comes when you burn the stuff. This is actually an uprater, which, as you can see, has some pretty drastic impacts on the water in the region, but it also means releasing a ton of CO2. And the carbon emissions that are released, not just in the upgraders and not just in the processing, but also, once it's shipped somewhere else through pipelines right here to British Columbia, but also to Asia, India, down into the United States. I mean, this is the role Canada is playing right now in the climate change debates has a lot to do with this. So how does this tie to BC? Well, what you see here is a proposed pipeline. This is the Gateway pipeline. This is kind of the gateway of the north. And this pipeline would move about a third of the existing bitumen that's being produced in the tar sands through northern British Columbia. It would be the largest clear cut in the history of BC just to build this thing. And it would move about a third of the existing bitumen to Kitimat, where it would be loaded onto tankers, and then it would take 3 different routes through the Hecate Strait to China and to India. And of course, if you start moving about a third of what exists, you need to expand what's going on in the tar sands currently. So, right here in BC, we do have an opportunity to have a pretty drastic impact on the future of Canada's role in climate change, because if we say no to this, and if we say no to this, then we can potentially drastically increase the amount of CO2 that we're actually contributing, not just in Canada, but also in terms of our enabling people around the world to burn more and more of what is quite a dangerous substance ultimately.
Can I just chip in, Ben, that
Yeah.
the North Coast First Nations are pretty opposed to that pipeline?
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
One of our hopes is
And maybe during the question and answer period at the end, we could talk more about that, because that is a very interesting part of the discussion, is sort of looking at the folks in the north versus the folks in the south. I can tell you that people in the north of British Columbia are far more aware of the potential negative impacts of that project than we are about the southern part of the Gateway project, which I'll get to momentarily. So really it's all about these tankers. These are the tankers that are leaving potentially from our coast, filled with bitumen to head to places throughout the Asia Pacific region along these routes that I just showed you. And then this is what's coming in the other direction. So this is what the Gateway of the South is all about. More and more containers filled with goods being made in China and India, making their way into Canada to then be shipped or to be taken by diesel truck or by train to various locations throughout Canada and down into the United States. So what we have here is a map of the proposed Gateway project in BC, and I'm just going to take a second.